Last week we officially concluded the Beatitudes with Matthew 5, verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It seemed appropriate to me that we include the little postscript to this section, which feels like an expansion of verse 10. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Same basic formula, blessed are, those we're talking about, for blessings will look something like this. Also, we're still talking about persecution. The first thing we notice is that Jesus is speaking directly to his listeners. Instead of blessed are those, he says, blessed are you when others revile you, persecute you, utter all kinds of evil against you falsely. So who's he talking to? Let's reestablish the context of the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 4. Jesus' ministry is just getting going. He's faced down the devil's temptations with flying colors. He's called Peter, Andrew, James, and John to be his first disciples. Starting in verse 23, and he went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. Jesus' popularity is soaring. Great crowds are gathering from all over the nation and beyond. Remember, Decapolis and beyond the Jordan were Gentile areas. They're being healed and hearing the gospel. So, chapter 5, verse 1 sets the context. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. These are the ones who aren't just there for the healings or to hear some great preaching, but willing to step out from the crowd and identify as his and to follow him. And he warns them, it's not all healings and speeches and zingers for the Pharisees. You will face persecution. And this time it's more specific than verse 10. Revile. Utter all kinds of evil falsely. And the reason is specific as well. It's not just for righteousness' sake this time, but on my account, for being a disciple of Jesus. If you identify as a follower of Jesus, or a Christ one, or a Christian, don't be surprised when this happens. By the way, if you're not a follower of Jesus, don't be surprised when you see this happen to them. It can be subtle, or it can be overt. It can be wrapped up in a righteous cause, or just plain old-fashioned hatred. But it's nothing new. It's been happening as long as God has been sending out his followers as his messengers. And it's the story that the author of our next play saw played out between his own parents. Paper Wings by Gillette Elfgren is part of the Faith on Stage anthology of plays. The copy we're using was graciously provided at no charge by the author. I first heard this play at a conference back in 1995 in San Diego. The following year, I enrolled at Regent University so I could have him as my advisor and got to hear him talk about his process of creating this play. Let's try to keep the name straight. Gillette Elfgren Jr., playwright, is the author of Paper Wings. His father, Gillette Elfgren Sr., was a famous pinup artist. In addition to magazines and calendars, his works were reproduced as nose art on World War II aircraft. It is considered fairly innocent today, very risque back in the 1930s when he began. He has been called the Norman Rockwell of pinups until his death in 1980, and collections of his works are still being published. Gil Jr., the playwright, grew up in an artist's colony and once described his father, Gil Sr., as a raging pagan. In the midst of all this, Gil Jr.'s mother became a born-again Christian. So you can imagine how that went over in an artist's colony, not to mention with Gil Sr. And Gil Jr. grew up watching his parents in constant conflict over her beliefs. Eventually, in 1994, Gil Jr. wrote Paper Wings based on that experience. His father was recast as Stan, a university lecturer and poet, and his mother was renamed Jamie. Technically, the events and characters are fictional, but for this playwright, the conflict was profoundly personal. Our plan for class is to read and meditate on this play together. Each of you has or will be given a scene to read as either Stan or Jamie, or as the narrator. If you prefer not to read, please let me know in advance, and I'll be happy to come up with an alternative assignment. In the meantime, before you start rehearsing your part, make yourself a beverage, sit back, relax, and give yourself a couple of hours to read the play all in one sitting. We'll see you in class.